Training camp is officially underway, which means the long-awaited return of NBA basketball is right around the corner. This offseason, we saw plenty of big moves made that resulted in some teams looking to emerge in a big way this year, but we also saw teams bungle their opportunities and very well may end up worse this season. And this brings us to the topic of today's video. Today will be a continuation of yesterday's video, where we will be going through every team in the NBA, and we'll be giving a grade to their off-seasons, taking into account how they drafted, the players that they signed in free agency, and the trades that they made. Last video we went through the teams in the Eastern Conference, so today we'll be going through the teams in the Western Conference, and if you missed that last video, go check it out after you watch this one. Before we start though, it turns out about 57% of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so please, if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but I would also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Going in alphabetical order, we'll start with the Dallas Mavericks, and the grade for their offseason is a B-. The Mavericks almost pulled off a big upset in the first round of the playoffs this year against the Clippers, and Luka Doncic showed he's fully ready to compete at the highest level. He just needs some help. The priority for the Mavericks was supposed to be getting him a legitimate number 2 option, but the team instead opted to bring back mostly the same team with the exception of adding Reggie Bullock to replace the departing Josh Richardson, which I think is definitely an upgrade. They didn't have a bad offseason by any means, but Luka is still going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them, which just isn't ideal. The Denver Nuggets are next up, and the grade for their offseason is a C+. The Nuggets are another team that really weren't all that active despite being a team with the talent to look to contend. They lost Paul Millsap in free agency, but they signed Jeff Green, and they most notably gave Michael Porter Jr. a max contract just the other day, which feels like a massive risk given the fact that he's not actually an all-star caliber player quite yet, even though he very well could be soon. The Nuggets are banking on Jamal Murray returning to full strength, which is another gamble, but it could prove to be enough as reigning MVP Nikola Jokic, similar to Luka Doncic who we just discussed, will have to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the team again. Next up is the Golden State Warriors, and the grade for their offseason is a B+. The Warriors didn't have much money to spend in free agency, but they definitely made do with what they had. They may have lost Kelly Oubre and Kent Bazemore, but both had a bit of a down season last year, and in their place, the team brought in Otto Porter Jr. on a very team-friendly contract. Then they also had 2 lottery picks in the draft, and honestly, they crushed it by selecting both Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody with those picks, both of which I was very high on as prospects at the time of the draft, and their showings in Summer League further pushed that belief. Up next, we have the Houston Rockets, and the grade for their offseason is a solid A. The Rockets are in rebuild mode, and everything they did this summer further enhanced how smoothly their rebuild should go in the future. In the draft, they brought in Jalen Green, who arguably has as much star potential as Cade Cunningham, who was taken first. They also drafted Josh Christopher and Alperen Sengun, who both of those guys looked like they can contribute quickly from what we saw from them in Summer League, and in free agency, they got players like Daniel Tice and David Nwaba on reasonable contracts that can easily be moved if necessary. Up next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and the grade for their offseason is a B. Things started on a pretty positive note when they re-signed all of their key contributors who were free agents from last year, including Kawhi Leonard, who was obviously huge, and then Reggie Jackson and Nicholas Batum as well. They also signed Justice Winslow, who is a player that comes in with a lot to prove for them. What I wasn't necessarily a fan of, though, was their trade for Eric Bledsoe, because even though it did save them some money in the luxury tax, I'm just pretty skeptical of his fit as a player on the team, coming off of a down year in New Orleans, who has also never really been a very good shooter or playmaker for those around him, which are 2 things that the Clippers probably need from their point guard. Next up is the Los Angeles Lakers, and the grade for their offseason is a firm A+. The Lakers, to put it simply, killed it this summer. They completely revamped the roster, bringing in the perfect balance of youth and experienced veterans to surround LeBron James and Anthony Davis, plus they made a great trade to acquire Russell Westbrook as well. Guys like Malik Monk and Kendrick Nunn are promising young scorers still developing, and veterans like Carmelo Anthony, Wayne Ellington, Trevor Ariza, and Dwight Howard will help in the games that matter most, so in my opinion, they had the best offseason of all. Next up is the Memphis Grizzlies, and the grade for their offseason is a B-. The Grizzlies seemed way ahead of schedule making the playoffs last season, but now it feels as though they're reverting back to focusing on their rebuild. They traded away Jonas Valanciunas in exchange for Steven Adams and Eric Bledsoe, with Adams being a clear downgrade at the position, and then they moved Bledsoe for what turned into Jarrett Culver and Juancho Hernangomez. They also drafted Zaire Williams with the draft pick that they received in the Jonas Valanciunas trade, which is still to be determined because of how raw Williams' game is right now. They didn't have a bad offseason per se, but I do see them taking a step back because of it. Up next, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves, and the grade for their offseason is a D. The Timberwolves are a team stuck in the basement, and they didn't really do anything to change that this summer. They lost their draft pick because of a protection on it by the Warriors, so they didn't get to draft anyone this year, and the only notable addition they made was Patrick Beverley. Teams in their position really shouldn't be as inactive as they were, and yet here we are, and the team even fired their general manager because of this. Next up is the New Orleans Pelicans, and the grade for their offseason is a D+. The Pelicans are yet another example of a team with a solid young core looking to take that next step, but the front office really didn't help them this summer. They re-signed Josh Hart and Willy Hernangomez, but they let Lonzo Ball walk in hopes of landing Kyle Lowry. They didn't land Kyle Lowry, so they then settled for a sign-and-trade for Devontae Graham, who is a clear downgrade, especially defensively where this team already has its struggles. Next up is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and the grade for their offseason is a C+. The Thunder did most of their work in the draft, where they drafted Josh Giddey, Trey Mann, Aaron Wiggins, and they got Jeremiah Robinson-Earl in a trade. They did also give Shai Gilgeous-Alexander a max contract extension too, showing that they believe in him to lead them into their future. The Josh Giddey pick is the big one though, because he's such an interesting prospect with tantalizing strengths as a passer and playmaker, but glaring weaknesses as a shooter and overall scorer, and his development could prove to either be brilliant or a bit of a reach. Next up is the Phoenix Suns, and the grade for their offseason is a B. As the reigning runner-ups in the NBA, having lost in the finals, they're already built for a solid season, but they didn't necessarily bolster themselves that much. They re-signed Chris Paul and Cameron Payne, both of which were huge priorities for them, and they also brought in JaVale McGee, Elfrid Payton, and Landry Shamet, so their work was more so around the edges of the rotation, which should still bode well for them overall. Next up is the Portland Trail Blazers, and the grade for their offseason is a D. Damian Lillard, for the first time ever, started to show his frustration with the state of the franchise this offseason, stating how much he wants big improvements to be made to help the team contend for a title. Instead, though, the front office arguably built a worse team for this upcoming season. They signed players like Cody Zeller and Tony Snell, who are both decent rotational pieces, but they lost Carmelo Anthony, Derrick Jones Jr., Enes Kanter, and Zach Collins, so if anything, they probably took a step back instead of taking one forward, and who knows how much patience Damian Lillard has left. Next up is the Sacramento Kings, and the grade for their offseason is a B-. Again, the Kings are another team that really didn't do a whole lot to improve themselves this summer, with the majority of their moves coming in the form of either re-signing their own players that hit free agency, plus they added Tristan Thompson, who is a solid backup center for them. The move I liked most for them was drafting Davion Mitchell 9th overall, because even though some people point out they have a crowded backcourt now, Mitchell brings elite perimeter defense and shooting to that unit as something that the team desperately needed more of. Up next is the San Antonio Spurs, and the grade for their offseason is a B+. The Spurs are finally shifting their focus towards the future after a long-sustained level of success for about 2 decades, and this offseason was definitely a success for them. They could have lost DeMar DeRozan for nothing in free agency, but they got Thaddeus Young and Al-Farouq Amino back in a sign-and-trade with the Chicago Bulls, and they also signed a strong group of rotational players in free agency, such as Doug McDermott, Zach Collins, and Bryn Forbes. The one big question mark from their summer was drafting Josh Primo in the lottery, which was way earlier than literally anybody thought that he would be picked, so they took a big gamble there, but did pretty well otherwise. And finally, the last team in the West is the Utah Jazz, and the grade for their offseason is a B. The Jazz were the 1 seed last year, but came up short in the playoffs, so they were looking to make some moves in the margins to improve, and they definitely did that. They re-signed Mike Conley, they traded away Derek Favors to clear up some cap space, and then they signed players like Hassan Whiteside, Eric Paschall, and Rudy Gay to bolster their depth. It wasn't a loud offseason for them, but it was still a pretty good one. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below how you would grade the off seasons these teams just had. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.